on the first Sunday of each month, it's our tradition that we have a music instead of a spoken reading. And so I'd like to welcome back Pete and Paul to perform for us now.
Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us. Above us only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for. And no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You might say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one. Imagine no possession. I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger. A brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say that I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one.
A fifth-generation Oregonian, Wendy Gerlach is deeply aware of how forests play an essential role in the welfare of our state. She is the Senior Conservation Project Manager with Pacific Forest Trust, where she oversees its Oregon activities, managing conservation easement and other forest-related projects. Her past experience includes forest-based conservation finance and nonprofits transactions, as well as advising on finance and business issues in the US and Europe. She has worked on forestry projects ranging from carbon offset to conservation easements on working forest lands. A graduate of Princeton University and the University of Washington School of Law, Wendy is a board member of Columbia Land Trust and Oregon League of Conservation Voters. Her interest in forests and in plants in general began early with her botany-loving grandmother, who, caring for her often from the time Wendy was 2, referred to plants by their genus and species names. She says it stuck. Botany may be the jumping off place, but Ms. Gerlach must also concern herself with a range of forestry issues, several of which she will consider with us today. We are pleased to welcome Wendy Gerlach.
Thank you so much for the invitation to spend this time with you this morning. I love the music. I miss hearing live music. I've heard some people playing in the park and it's been such a treat. And this morning's music was a treat of the same kind. And I'll also mention that I'm a completely unabashed singer in the car. You know, at first I would be singing to the radio with a sort of a sheepish look or stopping when traffic passed. Now I find that one of the joys of life is just going for it. So it was fun sharing that music with you this morning. Thanks also for the nice introduction, which did capture a number of things that are important to me and that I'll touch on today. Yeah, my background is an Oregonian. I think forests are very deeply entwined in the history of this state, partly because they're some of the most amazing forests in the world. And my involvement with them has ranged from, you know, a recreational one to overlapping with my profession and now very deeply part of my profession. So with that, I think I'll switch to my presentation, which involves a PowerPoint. All right, well, as I mentioned, I'm with Pacific Forest Trust. I want to introduce myself, which I think we've already started with talking a little bit about me. There I am in my hard hat. This is the first kind of work. Well, I did some conservation finance before, but this is my first job where I'm likely to need a hard hat. Pacific Forest Trust is an organization that started in California in the 90s. It has started out in policy as well as conservation easements, which we'll talk about later. It has expanded to, it does work on policy throughout the Northwest and nationally, and also is very involved in holding forests itself, managing forests, and in addition, really enhancing habitat and watersheds for public use and public benefit. In this picture, I also include, because I'm talking about trees, I want to make sure to mention to you what trees I'm showing here. This is a butterfly, a California tortoiseshell, that is sitting in a noble fir at about 6,000 feet. And these butterflies are butterflies that fly in big flocks in the summer. This one was from about 2 years ago. They have explosions of populations and then contractions, which is something we see a lot of in the natural world. Very adaptable to changes in when climate, among other things, but also this is a normal thing for this butterfly to have large seasonal population growth and then contraction the next year. Getting down to what we do at Pacific Forest Trust, I like it when we're out on the land. This is a picture of one of our projects. There I'm with my colleague Connie, just out wandering in this project area. Now, sometimes when we look at field like this, we just see, oh, it's a field and the mountains. But when we're out there working, we look at it really in great detail to see what is, at this time, this was recently, so it is past its lush stage, but it's a mountain meadow that starts out very, very green, becomes somewhat dormant by the end of the season. It is surrounded by various conifers. This is mainly white fir, which is a somewhat marginal timber tree. You know, as you probably know, living in Oregon, Douglas firs are the tree that, and ponderosa pines are the two trees that are most valuable and most desired, but white fir is also an important timber tree. And around the edges of this meadow, there are ponderosa pines, which are the smaller, fluffier trees on the right of your screen, where you can, those have been largely planted, partly, this is a commercial timber ownership, partly in response to climate change, because ponderosa is a tree that does better in warmer climates than the white fir that's largely native to this area. So Pacific Forest Trust, I put that forest in green because that's the organizing principle of this organization. It started out truly working with forests, again, on the policy side, which is affecting laws about how forests are managed, but also very much working with private landowners. Our mainstay is a conservation easement, which is a voluntary agreement with landowners to change the management of the forest. The forest management, I wanted to talk about this picture first. This is a picture of harvest. This is a harvester in this picture. This is a stand of, there are a few spruces in there. It's mainly Douglas fir. And this is a large, you can look at the bottom of this. Can you see my cursor? Yeah, not very well. Anyway, very, very large soft tires to allow it to go over the forest floor. You'll see that there's a lot of moss and ferns on this forest floor. This forests are especially designed to distribute its weight evenly so it doesn't damage the habitat on the forest floor too much. It goes in there, and with that, you can see the pincer at the front that's kind of highlighted a bit by the sun here. But it actually picks up that vertical tree and the controllers were amazing. They can then lay it down in a space they have created, and then a hauler comes and drags it out of the forest. So this is an example of a kind of environmentally sensitive forestry that can be removing trees that are of commercial value. This is really a thinning project. They're taking out the smaller trees to let the other trees grow, create a more natural forest, but also to create larger trees that will then eventually be harvested. So the three things there are four really that Pacific Forest Trust focuses on in its forest work and its policy work, and it's trying to positively change the way forests are managed, are wood, because we're committed to the idea that we use wood in our society, in our economy. We need wood. And what we believe is that we can provide wood at the same time our forests are providing other benefits. I put this picture in here because it's a picture I took in Switzerland, where I lived for a long time. I lived there most of the 90s. Just as an example, just thinking about different ways to work in the forest. In Switzerland, if you see the forest in the background, that's mainly a fir and spruce conifer forest. This is in the inland valley, so fairly high elevation. They have strict land use laws there. You can see in the background that there's some industrial buildings right next to productive farmland, the fallow field behind this train car. And they are taking these trees to market. They've been selected just one by one out of this forest to meet their timber needs. I love this picture. This is a picture of where I was last week for work, so that was nice. Most of the time I'm actually at my computer, but this was a beautiful trip to a property that is currently private property. We have an agreement with the landowner, again, voluntary agreement by which the land is managed for natural resilient forest with reduced fire hazard, and the older trees are much more resistant to fire as well. And this is the path to the spring. I like this picture because it's the top of the hill. It's really the headwaters of the spring that becomes a creek called Neal Creek, which flows into the Rogue Basin. The picture to the right is in a deep forested cleft in this hill that flows into the Rogue River. And you might have heard this, that many rivers in Oregon, but the Rogue in particular, being in the south, has high water temperatures. Like the city of Medford is involved in a number of mitigation activities to try and cool the water down. So this project of ours is based on reducing the cutting of trees in this critical watershed, still removing timber, but making sure that when we remove the timber, we do so in a way that protects this cold water. Another key aspect of our management principles is managing for wildlife. A lot of our projects involve creating connectivity for wildlife migration, often connectivity for, say, birds moving vertically. Birds, some of them, have large migration paths, but other birds are moving, from forest to meadow. They're moving from higher to lower elevations. They require spaces with which they can move around. So this is an example of a meadow with just pointing out again what's really in this meadow. If you look at it carefully, it has a shrub called ocean spray in the foreground, Holodiscus discolor. It has some incense cedars mixed in the forest. Again, a lot of white fir, some Douglas fir. And this, again, is a little bit later in the season now, but basically what's a wet meadow with a lot of different grasses in there. It has snags and decaying wood. When I walked by this, I thought, this is excellent habitat. They're observing this as I went by. A little ways down the road, my dog started barking. I called my dog back, and what did I see behind a log? I didn't take the picture on the left, but I was standing on this Forest Service road, and behind a log, there was a little bear, and I enjoyed seeing the little bear. But within a split second, I had grabbed my bear spray, looked around for the mother, and headed on down the road. So I enjoyed seeing that, in fact, this kind of habitat, when you look at it, you think this would be wonderful habitat. It was fun to see these bears out actually they're rooting around in the decaying wood to look for grubs. Finally, another key aspect of the work we do is working on well-being, human well-being, because although we're managing for wildlife habitat, we are truly all in this together. So the advances that we can make for climate, for wildlife, providing better water, providing open spaces and recreation are all important. And the biggest picture here is a picture of foresters out in the wood, because we don't want to forget that, like I mentioned, part of our principle is that we need to provide forest products because we use them, but do so in a better way. So these are two foresters connected with a project of ours. They're sitting in a grove of trees. There's, you can see behind the younger, well, that forester in the blue shirt, let's call him, a tree that's marked for harvest. So this is the tree of an age that is appropriate for harvest. In this kind of harvest, we leave big trees. It's one of the key things about managing a forest well, is not just going and taking out the best, biggest trees, but to leave a variety of ages of trees, including older trees that are fire resistant and leave habitat. So I've put in a picture there on the left of a park in Seattle with redwoods that have been planted. I think this creates, among the other things I've done, I studied the history of parks, the role of public land in social welfare, and landscape architecture briefly. And one of the things I remember well from studying landscape architecture was the professors reminding that we have sort of a primal need for the kinds of environments you see in a well-designed park. And this picture has some of those. It has a path, it has a sense of place, it has the shelter of the trees, it has a meadow that suggests plenitude, food sources. It creates a sort of tranquility that I think is important to human well-being. Now I couldn't resist putting a couple pictures of hikers down below. Just recreation is important. It's not, human recreation in forests definitely needs to be combined with the thoughts of who else is using the forest. But it is, again, an important contributor to our well-being. And it, Pacific Forest Trust has many properties with public access provided as part of a conservation easement. I've been talking a lot about conservation easements, so I haven't seen anyone flag a question about that, but I'll go into that a little deeper because it's one of our main working tools. When we think about ways to try and make a change, we think of changing the laws, finding people who want to work voluntarily with us, and thinking broadly about what public benefits can be, for instance, how we can protect watersheds. Well, for us, working forest conservation easements is a key part of what we do. We have protected easements in over 100,000 acres. They are in California and Oregon. The way a conservation easement works, and I'm gonna get a little technical on this, I am a lawyer after all, it's an agreement. So working forest conservation easement is a deed. So real estate transactions occur through the recording of a deed. Often it's just a deed to transfer real property like a house. But a conservation easement is a deed of conservation easement. It's an agreement between Pacific Forest Trust or another holder. It could be another nonprofit or also a government agency. But an organization like Pacific Forest Trust that agrees to hold this agreement and enforce an agreement with a landowner, where the landowner agrees to manage the forest for a number of different benefits. In particular for the ones I mentioned, which are wood, water, wildlife, often carbon sequestration, and for better fire resilience. But we define these very specifically. A typical conservation easement, a very simple one, might just say, oh, this land has to remain in, say, agricultural use or open space or forest use. That'd be very simple, just saying that it can't be subdivided or converted to a different use. We developed a form of conservation easement that's widely used now that has a lot of detail. It requires a management plan, but in addition to that, the details of the forestry that will take place. We have management zones. We have zones that are dedicated specifically to improving the state of this forest, in particular for habitat, for leaving a very diverse age of trees, a canopy. By canopy, I mean the upper level of trees where they were creating shade and shelter for the underlying trees. And I want to show you think the next slide goes through. Yeah, here I talked about some of this already, the main points, that there won't be conversion from forest land. It's perpetual. I hadn't mentioned that. A conservation easement is recorded and it is forever. I suppose nothing is forever, but it is a perpetual restriction, an agreement with a landowner, but the landowner agrees to manage for these conservation values. There are retention requirements and restrictions on the amount of clear cuts that can be taken out. That means just retaining canopy, keeping protection of streams by not cutting right next to the streams. And I put on the next slide, one of the important points that one might not think of is the importance of snags and large trees. In the conservation easement, we have specific requirements of the number of snags that are left, and they get really specific about this. It can't just be little snags or snags that have been damaged in the harvest process. We have different requirements for snags, say from 20 inches in diameter up, having a certain number per acre that are retained in harvested forest units, and in openings as well. And for this, I put on the left a picture of an unusual animal called a fisher. This is one of those animals that's in the weasel family. It is a large, it's related to martins as well. It loves living in big openings in larger trees, such as shown here. So it requires fairly natural forest with large trees and large snags with openings in it for it to live. And that's the kind of forest we are creating through our projects.
We have a couple questions. Ingrid has a question. Simply, what are snags?
Oh, good question. Well, a snag is a dead tree, just a tall dead tree. That's, for instance, that hasn't fallen down yet. So this is a picture of a snag, which is to say it is a tree that is still has some structural integrity. It is dead, but it's still standing. And these are used a great deal by woodpeckers. Often start the initial holes. They kind of break through the bark. This is probably a woodpecker hole that's been enlarged by other animals. So that's why they're important. They're critical for wildlife habitat.
And Al has a question.
No, that's for later.
Or later. Oh, I'm sorry. No, we don't have a question. Go ahead. Thank you so much.
Sure. But I thank you for the interruption, because I want to be clear. So don't hesitate. This is just that we work lots with maps. I love maps. I feel they give you a wonderful sense of place. One of my favorite things to do is to wander around with good map. And in this job, you get to use them a great deal. This is a picture from one of the documents attached with one of our conservation easements. And I just thought I would put it up here. You can see this is a section. So it is a section of real property. The edges it's actually a inholding. The surrounding land is national forest land. We like to do projects like this because when you have an inholding like this that is, say, not managed well, it cuts up the usable habitat for wildlife. If we preserve this section, then wildlife can travel through it from the areas from the sides around it. But I wanted to show you in particular the way that we have analyzed the streams. There are little blue dots showing all the streams. And then the blue shaded parts are what we require to be managed for primarily habitat purposes. So we have some chaparral zones, we have some meadow, we have this rock, it's called the rock zone, which was a rocky zone with some special habitat in it. So this is just an example of how when we sit down to analyze how we're going to improve forest management, we really look very specifically at what's on the ground, what the water is, and where the landowner with us creates this diagram of what the landowner's management plan will be in terms of harvest. In the areas that are not shaded, it will be harvest that is subject to some of these guiding principles, such as leaving certain trees and some retention requirements. But inside the shaded areas, this is really a habitat-focused management area. as I mentioned, I've been lucky enough, summer is our field season, so I've been lucky enough to be out in the woods a bit. And I wanted to show this picture just as an example. The place I was walking through the woods with a forester recently. And this is what he called high grading. This is something that was logged a long time ago. My guess is about 20 years ago, maybe a little less. But in this is commercial forest land where at that time, this is really not done very much anymore, fortunately, but just came in with a whole lot of cats and created a lot of skid roads where they access roads and then skids, which is where they drag the trees down to the road, put them on a truck. And this ends up cutting up the landscape a fair amount and knocking down a lot of trees and destroying habitat for quite a small number of trees that are taken out. And when the biggest trees only are taken out and they leave all the other trees, you end up with a lot of competing regrowth. And it's, again, a forest that has a lot of clutter in it that's subject to fire. It tends to be dark. It does not allow the trees to grow in a natural way where each can achieve its own best self, shall we say. My next slide shows sort of a version of that, looking in a different arrangement, but where the trees, there was a clear cut on the side where I was standing when I took this picture. This is an older picture. You can see there's snow on the ground. But this is just an example of what you see pretty often here is a forest. It's an appealing forest. It has lovely, quite large trees, but they are very densely packed in there. They're pretty much all the same age. This is a kind of forest that could be, very productive as the next round of going in and taking the logs out, but it's not functioning very highly as a forest for other purposes. It is an even age forest. The trees are competing against one another and restricting growth. Often the forester will go into this and take out some trees to let the remaining trees grow to a larger size.
There was a question from Jim and Jessica. What is the benefit to the landowner? Is there money payment involved, or could you?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, it's an agreement with the landowner, and the landowner we often purchase a conservation easement from a landowner, so it can be paid for the conservation easement. There are a number of programs that can support that. Either private foundations often will pay for that, or there are certain agency programs like in Oregon, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board can fund the acquisition of conservation easements. It also sometimes funds the acquisition of land in fee, that is to say an entire interest in land rather than just a conservation easement. So we have some donated easements. In the case of a donated rather than a purchased easement, the donation gives a tax benefit to the donor. So there are a variety of situations. As I said, this is a situation where the landowner is willing to do it, sometimes for financial reasons, sometimes because a landowner might already be very interested in improving the quality of their forest management, could donate it, and then have, obviously a lot of rules about qualifying for the tax deduction, but a deduction is available for if the proper rules are followed. And as I mentioned, these forests, they're still receiving timber revenues from harvest in our working forest conservation easements. I think one thing I didn't mention there was there's an interesting process for appraising the value of conservation easement. If we're talking about the financial aspects of the transaction, you value what the value of the land is without the conservation easement, and then with the conservation easement, and figure out what the value of it is. And that's either the value you pay when you buy the easement, or the amount of the value of it for tax purposes if you're seeking a deduction. I wanted to, thanks for that question also. I wanted to show just an example of timber harvest. This is again in a project in the Siskiyou, so south of here. So you'll see there are a lot of madrone trees. Those really beautiful shiny brown red bark trees are madrones. They are interesting trees because they are they retain their leaves pretty much all winter long. They tend to lose them at this time of year. They get pushed off by the new leaves. They aren't really deciduous, but they have sort of a leaf rotation in the summer. So the harvest area on the left is overcrowded. It has lots of low-lying twigs and brush. And we visited this with our foresters and went through and looked at the sort of the after picture here, where there was the landowner removed trees, will send those to a mill. And there's a bit of it. You can see that, again, there's a little bit of slash burning up here in the front where there was remove some of the debris. But it's a much more open forest afterwards. This promotes forest health. Some of the worst, like I'm trying to remember that, like Swiss beetle needlecast or whatever the disease on the coast that's affecting a lot of Douglas firs, is a disease that's typical for forest disease, that if you plant trees too close together, kind of like with people, if you're too crowded, that's not good for public health purposes. This is true for trees too. So when you create more openings, you also create more space between trees, you create more passage of air through the trees, it reduces disease. So speaking of general health, and climate change comes up. That was sort of my presentation on our tool of conservation easement. I also want to talk about the work that Pacific Forest does in terms of addressing climate change. And because we're deeply involved in forest management and trying to improve those practices, that's the angle we take on it. Forests sequester carbon. They take CO2 out of the air and sequester it in their wood. And the climate crisis, well, we need to use all the resources at our disposal, and natural climate solutions is one of the main ways that we can reduce a significant percentage of the excess carbon dioxide. So this just runs through the various things that Pacific Forest Trust has worked on. Just to go back to the organization and a bit of its history. As I mentioned, it was started in the 90s. It started in California. So this was when work started of acknowledging that climate change was happening and thinking practically about ways to address it. The climate benefits of forests have been recognized for a long time internationally. There are a number of what are called protocols, like you've probably heard of, like the Kyoto Protocol on addressing climate change. California in the 90s was developing its own response to climate change in a bill that passed, I think it passed in 2006, but it was actually being worked on a long time before that. It has a number of ways to address climate change in the transportation and energy and many other sectors of society. But it, in particular, involves a forest carbon protocols and an offset credit program. So I thought I would talk about that a bit as well. Oh, I wanted to mention that Pacific Forest Trust helped develop that program as well. Under the Cap and Trade program, which is California's, addresses climate change in California, there's a carbon offset program, which Pacific Forest Trust registered the first program under that protocol. And also it's advised a number of other tribes and other forest owners and having their own carbon projects. This is a graph, you've probably seen similar graphs to this, but it's always worth remembering that we need to change our behavior. These are just the lines that go from right to left, just show different scenarios. On the left is emission scenarios. And the green line would be optimally, we would greatly reduce our emissions of CO2. On the right is just showing how much CO2 will be accumulated and stay in the atmosphere under the different scenarios. So you can see that on the right, if we want to flatten that curve of emissions, we need to actually reduce our emissions. And natural climate solutions are one of the, not the only tool, clearly, but one of the tools to do that. This slide just is demonstrating the different important sectors. The different colors in this circle are showing the different sectors: transportation, energy and industry, and changes to that are required. And it shows that 37% of mitigation of the CO2, i.e. reduction in CO2, can be achieved by natural climate solutions. And that can happen through changing our forest practices, by leaving old trees that are currently sequestering carbon, and some other related procedures. I want to show you this. Yeah, so to summarize, what I'm driving at is that forest loss increases CO2 emissions. because the forest is no longer sequestering any carbon. In addition, the actual harvest itself both removes the trees, so there's the transportation at a cost associated with that timber organ operation. In addition, the harvest process releases from the soil and debris additional emissions. And conversion of forest lands, which shown on this left side, I think this is up in the Puget Sound area. It's something we see often. We need homes and neighborhoods for people to live in, no question, but it is definitely better to have a kind of land use that has these occur in a way so that doesn't greatly reduce our forests. This is a dense graphic here, but I like it. It kind of sums up everything that I've been talking about. On the left, it talks about how forests can actually create emissions when the process of harvesting trees does itself create some emissions. And one thing that's talked about a lot, I know this is something that the Oregon Department of Forestry is doing research on, is when we harvest wood, how much carbon is sequestered in those wood products. Certainly quite a bit, especially timber that's put into houses and permanent uses. Of course, some fair amount of what our forests are used for pulp production. Those paper and other products don't last as long. But if you say clear cut a forest, the estimate for how much of what is removed is actually sequestered permanently, people argue about it, is somewhere between like 20 to 35%, about that amount. Another point on this chart that's interesting is it's saying that the CO2 storage in the forest is 90% in the trees and 10% in the soil. Sometimes it's easy to forget that the soil itself is an actual store of carbon.
There was a question from Jim and Jessica. Any comment about BECCS capturing carbon with wood and burning it for power, then capturing and burning the carbon, gets the oxygen from trees, then power, then sinks the CO2. I can get them to come on and explain that question a little better if I didn't do as good a job as I should have.
Yeah, I don't know when that is, so maybe they can say what they haven't.
Jim and Jess, could you unmute and talk about that a little bit?
There's something, I'm not an expert about this, but I read about it. There's bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration. That's what it is. That's what BECCS is. And what you do is you grow the trees, you produce oxygen and you capture carbon, and then you use that as a renewable source of power. I don't know how it compares with other sources. And then you only sequester the carbon after that, so that you get to kind of use it twice. You use the carbon capture in essence for growing the tree and producing oxygen, and then you use it for a renewable power source, and then you capture the carbon and sink it, bury it wherever we bury the carbon. So you kind of get two uses out of the carbon rather than the first one. I just wanted to know if you've heard about that and if you had any comments.
It's very controversial among conservationists whether it's a good idea or not.
Well, it's not something that I'm familiar with. It sounds like it's a strategy that puts together some of what I'm talking about, especially the final step there, the final sequestering. I wasn't sure how that was going to work. Because like in this chart that I have up right now, it involves some of the points you're talking about, which is to say, conserve and manage for older forests, thereby sequestering more carbon. And then using wood products in place of fossil fuel sources. And again, possibly it would be better not to use wood products, but to use, solar or wind power. There's a big discussion about what our next energy source will be. But the part that you described I didn't understand was the last one where you're saying you re-sequester it. What's the mechanism for that?
So again, I'm not an expert. I was hoping you were the expert. So, whatever plan we have currently for sinking carbon, which is not well developed, I agree. Whatever plan we develop, would happen after those two steps rather than just taking it out of the atmosphere?
I think it involves when they burn the wood, it's some kind of scrubbing the carbon out of the smokestack and then pumping it underground.
Right. So what we do with coal plants.
Yeah. I would just say about that that whole technology and whether or not it's going to be made energy neutral in terms of how feasible it is very much a discussion. And I know that there are federal tax incentives to try and develop that technology quickly because it's something we need. I haven't talked about it because it's not in my area of expertise. And also I think it's still under development. So not a very good answer to your question, but a good point made.
All right, thanks.
Renga had a point here that more buildings built with wood can lock up more carbon. Harvesting then will lead to less CO2 emissions, was his statement. And he can clock in, he could come in if he wanted to give a better explanation than I just did.
Yeah.
Renga, good. Here, Renga.
Yeah, what I'm trying to say is that if nowadays there are many buildings are up to maybe several stories made with just wood. So more such things are being made, then at least that part which is used for steel and concrete and things like that, which is very carbon intensive, can be reduced. I don't know what fraction of that will be used, but whatever contribution that can make, that will go towards mitigating the carbon problem. That's the idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And these are all techniques that people are developing in response to climate change. It's very true that wood is a preferable substance to certain kinds of concrete, which emit large amounts of CO2. So people are working absolutely on the technology to transfer away from the current building materials, and wood is part of that solution. And I know that there are certain groups that are advocating for all wood buildings with larger amounts of wood in them. But my point would be just to be when you're doing that math, coming up with that, considering the net effect of that, to remember that when you are harvesting wood, it's not 100% of the sequestered carbon in the forest that is transferred to wood product.
That's true.
So it's more like 30%. So this slide kind of fits into that explanation that 32% is transferred to wood products. And I don't think this graphic includes the cost of the emissions that are involved in getting those trees out of the forest and also at the mill, processing it and transporting it. So that's something to be kept in mind. It's not like right or wrong thing, or you shouldn't do it. It's more like most of these things, both things are the solution, but you've got to sort of keep in mind that you need to look at the net number in terms of how much carbon is sequestered in the forest versus how much carbon is sequestered in timber products. I mean, I would just say also that we need wood for practical purposes. So we will continue to harvest. The critical point is to do it in an efficient way, in a way that's good for the forest and also for the ecology around the forest and the communities involved.
Yeah. One more thing about carbon sequestration from power plants and so on. We still don't know how long they can really stay, whether they remain stable underground or whatever form they are putting in, what sort of life is there. So these are problems yet to be researched and solved. So we can't put all of our eggs in that basket saying that, well, that will solve the problem. We don't know yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Renga.
Yeah, and in this area, I would say there are some areas where you can figure out what you should do, even if they're gray areas where you are thinking, again, like I'm saying, we need to look at the net or this or that. But one thing that I think is widely agreed upon, I know there's a lot of research at the University of Washington. There's some good articles by Brent Davies in collaboration with the University of Washington about simply longer rotations are better for forests in almost all ways. They sequester more carbon, So even if you're going to eventually harvest those trees, you end up sequestering more carbon if you let a longer period pass between harvest rotations. So by that I mean on forest lands, often now trees are, especially in places like Oregon where trees grow quickly, there's water, it's really prime forest land. They can be harvested between 35 and 40 years of age. If you can push that out to 65, you get a big gain in a number of ways. One is more carbon is sequestered. Old trees store more carbon. And you have a much more natural fire resilient kind of forest as well. It's not this dense, even age forest of small packed trees that's very susceptible to fire. And I put this picture in here. This is a beautiful tree, I think. It's an incense cedar, not so common around Portland, but lots of them in Southern Oregon. Larger trees that are standing in the forest store a huge amount of carbon and also sequester large amounts of carbon because they are so large. Even if the rate of growth is smaller, the actual bulk that they're sequestering each year is high. So we have a real incentive where we have pockets of existing older trees to let those trees be our carbon sinks and part of our natural climate solution. This picture is my example, just a reminder that forests that are older, that have diverse kinds of trees, openings and canopies are much more efficient at storing water. The reason for this is if there are varied openings and amounts of sunlight and rain hitting the ground, the snow stays longer because it's released at different points of time. If you have simply a forest that's all even age, that's pretty much an even age way of storing snow and releasing water in the spring. If you have a dapplely varied forest with different kinds of trees and intensity of canopy, you'll have patches of snow that are released slowly over time. If you have a warm rain that hits a big forest that's all of the same kind, it will be releasing at the same rate all of that snow into water. If you have this kind of forest, it will be released, the snow will be melted and they're released slowly and last longer into the spring. So with that discussion of some management tools, I see I'm almost 11 o'clock. So I'll switch into just talking briefly about some other tools. I mentioned carbon offsets earlier, and it sounds like a number of you are pretty much up to date on tools like a cap and trade program or a cap and invest program like Oregon has been proposing in its legislature that would involve a carbon offset program. So just to provide the basic definition, which is on this slide, a carbon offset is when an emitter of CO2 pays the owner of forest land, in this case, to sequester more carbon in order to offset the emissions that are being made by the electric or transportation or generating sector. So we have here a factory that is setting off CO2. The forest can be managed in a different way so that it is sucking in more carbon, and it gets paid by the emitter for doing so. So that's the simple definition of a carbon offset. Within a cap and trade program or a cap and invest program, you will have the cap and trade is essentially a cap that's put on emitters to ensure that they reduce their emissions over time as a response to climate change. And if that program includes a carbon offset program, then they're allowed to meet some of their compliance requirements by buying carbon offset credits that have been registered by forest owners. It's a complicated area, but that's the basic simplification that I think provides the main dynamic. There are a number of different forest offset types, and those include improved forest management, which is the one that I've been involved with. I worked on a big carbon project in a redwood forest in California. This was a Climate Action Reserve registered project for improved forest management. with the California Air Resources Board cap and trade program. And just to break that down a little bit, the process there is that a forest owner decides that it looks at the inventory of its forest and sees that if it has sequestered carbon stored in that forest and can continue to sequester carbon. If it decides it wants to go do a project, it goes talks to what's called a registry. And there is the American Carbon Registry and the Climate Action Reserve are two. And they register their program. They develop it by coming up with a clear plan and modeling for what they're going to change about the way they manage their forest to make sure they're bringing in more carbon than they were before. It's part of how you get what's called additionality, to make sure you're improving the situation. And then they go through a process that involves verifying that each year there actually are sequestering more carbon. So when that is done, they get to register the additional sequestered carbon every year and sell those credits to a covered entity, one that is regulated by, say, the California program. So those are some of the technical steps in doing a carbon project. That's an example of the kind that I worked on. There are others. There are also voluntary projects where a forest owner will decide to do a voluntary project. They see what carbon is stored in their land. They see how they could change their forest practices to sequester more carbon. And they register that with, say, the Climate Action Reserve, but they sell those credits to, say, often they're private industries, like for instance, I think like Range Rover car manufacturers, many other industrial corporations buy voluntary credits so they can say that they're offsetting their carbon footprint. And they are in this way by buying these offset credits. So that's my summary. I would imagine people might have questions about that and about the program in general. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
Al has a question, and Joyce. So those they've already, and then folks, if you want to ask questions, just type your name or your question into the chat box. Okay, Al. You're gonna have to come forward. Okay, if you, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, here's Al Christian.
Okay. There's this phenomenon in the 21st century of diseases transferring into humans to from wildlife. About once every other year now, on the average, we get a new disease. And then a bunch of old diseases from wildlife as well. You know, Lyme disease. We got some plague here in Oregon every now and then. So biothreats are a big deal now, and of course you're talking about change. Everything's got to change. How does this affect you if we're worried about you know, keeping the wildlife from causing trouble from people, as well as trying to keep the people from causing trouble for wildlife? What do you have to change? Do you have to change your easements so to include these other potential biohazards as things that you might want to mitigate as part of your wise management of this forest land?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's always hard to imagine what biohazards are going to emerge in the future.
Yeah.
So without a crystal ball, it's hard to say that. I will say that part of our philosophy is a natural forest management that will create resilience in climate change. And part of that is allowing a reservoir for organisms to continue to function better in their current forms, to slow down the rate of change in these pockets of conserved landscapes, where you would see perhaps fewer morphs into a non-desirable ecology. But that is an area of, you know, that's really more of a disease control kind of a suggestion. There, you know, I was thinking about what organisms I can think of on properties that we have that would be problematic. The first one that came to mind was bats. Bats love living in the thick, dense kind of plated bark of old growth trees. And of course, bats have been, you know, connected with disease vectors for humans. But in fact, in most cases, the bats, there have been a lot of bat disease outbreaks caused by their contact with humans rather than the other way around. So even in, say, the case of something like bats, I would often, if we provide adequate habitat for bats in the forest where they wish to live, there might be fewer of these animals exiting the woods and coming into human habitation. So I would say that I don't have a good answer for your question. I would say that, sorry, did you switch my screen share?
Yeah, David must have done that.
Yeah, not a problem. I see someone looking very much like a Cheshire cat, like appearing and disappearing.
Come forward a little bit, honey.
Interesting. Anyway, that's not a specialist in disease, but that's my argument for why it is a good thing to maintain natural forests, and to keep animals in a healthy habitat for them is probably better for humans as well.
Would you compare your approach then to the half-Earth approach of saying that nature needs half the Earth and people could have the other half, and that we should not maybe have so much contact between the two halves?
We are nature.
So I would think I would say that. This is partly I here as a representative of Pacific Forest Trust, but this is sort of a question about that I'm just going to answer more on a personal level. I feel like we are entwined. Thinking that we will have simply a reserve and a human side, I don't see that happening. I think that there will always be permeability between the human habitation and the animal habitation, and to think of good ways of dealing with that is one of the essential parts of our work. And so I am, and also partly because I said our organization believes that people are going to be managing forests for things they need. I think that is an inevitability, including timber. And so our organization focuses on harvest that maintains all these other important values. Water is a key one of those. A lot of our work has been working on getting recognition for natural watersheds and natural infrastructure, where we think of how we protect our water supply, dams, and other concrete mechanisms. We need to think more like we have wetlands that function as water storage. We need to recognize that and have good systems for promoting that kind of natural infrastructure. And when we have legislation that's funding infrastructure, to remember those infrastructures. And again, that's something that benefits both the human and the natural side, but I don't see building a wall between them.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Joyce had a comment. Joyce, can you unmute and explain?
I did.
Thank you so much.
Just last night, I was reading a book on human cooperation, and the author made a point that trees cooperate. And the way he explained it is that in the summer, the trees with the higher canopy can preserve the sun's energy, and the trees below that, often evergreens, which don't have the, cannot reach the sun, express through the fungi in the earth, that's in the soil, that they are lacking energy, and the taller canopied trees will provide it. And then in the winter, when the deciduous trees have lost their leaves, they will put out a call for energy from the evergreens, and they will provide it through the same fungi. Did I explain that correctly, and could you elaborate?
Okay. This is awesome. It's such interesting stuff. I want to share my screen again because I had something about that in it. So these are, I had some books because I know that humanists love to learn. So these are my two favorite trees in my butterfly book. So Ecological Forest Management is a wonderful book. One of our board members, Jerry Franklin, is one of the co-authors. It is just the Bible on everything about variable retention, how to maintain canopy cover, and there's lots in there about good information about carbon offset and things like that for those of you who are asking questions about that more policy side. This butterfly book by Bob Pyle is a wonderful book, includes lots of wonderful stories, and he is the founder of the Xerces Society and lives in Oregon, Robert Pyle. But the question you just asked about trees, Joyce's comment, this book by Peter Wohlleben, some of you might have already read this, is an absolutely wonderful book that talks about the interaction of trees in the forest and the really amazing ways that they work together to make a better habitat for themselves. And they interact with lots of other organisms as well. I was out in the forest the other day and I saw a shrub, the one I mentioned before, ocean spray, a whole disc color. And I saw this strange plant beneath it blooming, these funny little purple flowers. And it turns out that it was a species of orobanche that's quite rare because it only lives on the roots of ocean spray. So there are all sorts of interesting connection between trees, the organisms that are living there with them that we're just barely learning about. This book by Peter Wohlleben is a great book on that topic. I think he has 3 books. This is the first in a trilogy. The other book I was going to recommend, which is off topic in a way, is a book called The Living by Annie Dillard. I love this book. It's kind of a hard read, but it's about the first European settlers. And of course it has Native American characters in it as well, trying to live together in the huge forests before they were first cut of the Pacific Northwest. And I recommend it as an example of life among the trees with a lot of challenges. This is another, if no one had a question slide.
Yeah.
I wanted just to mention this when we think, what is a tree? A tree is really a structural definition. And you all might be familiar with these plants. There's a dogwood tree on the left. So that's the Cornus nuttallii, and you see that with its beautiful flowers. And on the right at the bottom is a plant called Cornus canadensis, same genus, very close relative. You can see the similarity between them. The leaves of both have that kind of very distinctive sort of ovoid parallel veining. So they are very, very closely related. One is a woody tree that grows to 50 feet. The other is a little forest flower that grows to 3 inches. So
Wow.
just by way of thinking about what we mean when we talk about trees.
There's David, are you back yet, Dave? If not, we've got a question from Sue Pierce. Sue, can you unmute and ask a question?
Yes, hi, thank you. I'm interested in, because of a recent experience, I'll mention it, in threats to the forest, such as various kinds of beetles. Why do I ask? Because recently a friend and I found a huge beetle on his deck. I would say at least 2 inches long. And in looking up giant beetles to try to find it, figure out, we scooped it up and thrown it over the side of the deck. And yesterday I looked up giant beetles, and some of them are pine borers, and it's apparently not the beetle, but the larva. But can you talk to us a little more about the, and also in looking them up, I discovered that for some people, that would have been an important find, like seeing a rare bird.
Yeah, absolutely.
Talk a little bit about such things. That would be interesting.
Yeah, well, I would say that the beetle I know best, which a lot of people who spend time in the woods know, especially pine woods, is the pine beetle. And the pine beetle attacks pines. What it does is bore in a little hole, and then it has, and then under the bark, you can see if a tree then dies, you can see this sort of engraving like writing underneath the bark. Like a lot of beetles that attack trees, it's not so much the damage that the beetle does directly, it's rather they carry funguses. I think a number of, like there was the Dutch elm beetle, the similar, they are carrying, it's a little bit like fleas and the Black Death, you know, like the insect is the vector for the infection that attacks the primary organism. So pinal beetles are one that has created huge death in pines in Oregon, Central Oregon in particular, just forests of lodgepole pines that have basically just collapsed and are lying on the ground. In those areas, it's interesting to see what's coming up underneath. Often the firs and other some young pines, but firs, spruces, other trees are coming up through the dead pines. Over time, often more resistant organisms evolve past a particular pest. There's been a particular problem with pine beetles because they are very susceptible to cold, hard winters, kill them off. With climate change, those winters are less frequent. Sometimes also they proliferate because they can fit in more than one breeding cycle a year. So there's been a huge expansion of the number of pine beetles. I'm not an expert on that topic, so that's about as much as I could think to say.
Thank you, Megan.
Thank you.
I have just a question when or a thought, I guess. But when I was a kid, we were out in the woods all the time. We knew the woods. We named places. We could get there, get back. We were unsupervised for all day long and just out and exploring. This was on the East Coast or in near Buffalo, New York. But the forests here are so vast, and you know, if we got lost, we could have, if we'd walked 2 miles, we would get to a road or something. I mean, it was not the vast forest that you have here in Oregon. And so that so much of the going to the forest is going to trails, and that kids can't really just be alone, is my mind, you know, to just go out and explore. It's just, it's too vast. How do families, how do you see families getting out and having freedom out in the forest? I mean, rather than having to go to, well, we're all on the Multnomah Trail, or we're all on, you know, all these trails that have 50 people that you cross. How do you find those quiet places?
Well, I would say partly, how do we provide those quiet places? And to me, the answer is having more informal access, rather than having sort of the point like Dog Mountain where everyone has to go.
Right.
And more public access that is on perhaps informal trail systems. I would say, I think that in the metropolitan area of Portland, that Metro does a pretty good job of it passes bonds and adds parklands, in particular in suburban areas, actually does a pretty good job. I'm kind of familiar with Tualatin, of having a fair number of informal trails through woodlands that abut neighborhoods. To my mind, that's an example of really good urban planning. Yeah. In terms of areas that are further out, I think, I mean, people have different points of view, right? I really feel it's very important for people to get out into the woods. Someone was mentioning earlier, it might be better just to have a bright line and not mix the two. Yeah. Because the more people that are going out in the woods, the more they're harming it in terms of wildlife habitat. But I personally tend to feel that it's important for people to know about, like you were saying, to be familiar with the natural world. And that would suggest more trail building and more, not just having one main trail that everyone goes on, but have more side trails, so we don't all go to the woods but end up being in a very congested trail.
Thank you. Yeah, it just was such a wonderful way to grow up, to just have that freedom to pack a lunch and be gone all day. And I just don't see that happening, at least certainly not in how my daughter grew up in the suburbs.
No, and on the East Coast, there are far more community forests. That's something I haven't talked about, but the Pacific Forest Trust does support and work on, is creating community forests. I'm working on a project now that involves helping acquire property for community forests that would partly be providing logs to a local mill, but would also have significant public access for a community. So it would be like, I used to live on the East Coast for a long time, and I remember spending a lot of time cross-country in skiing in winter in a community forest. It never felt crowded because it was actually lots of little trails around. Here in the West, we tend to have, as you know, like you're saying, large tracts of public lands with a very few trails through them.
Right, and so it's just very different. It's just a very different system, and you know, all the the things that I remember of children getting lost and never found, or, you know, their bodies were found where they there was I just remember hearing those things happening, people getting lost and never found. And that never happened in the East Coast because it was so much more developed. You know, you'd hit a power line, or you'd hit a farmer's field,
well, there's a big difference between wilderness that's really wild and the recreational access to something like a community forest. And I would say that wilderness, we have to respect it.
Yes. Yeah, that's right. Just like the mountains. Yeah, just like the mountains. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Megan, thank you so much. Very much appreciated your presentation.